At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter for today's session, SHP's Senior Director, John Mesko. John, the floor is yours.
Here we go. Thank you, Amanda. Certainly appreciate your help in setting this up, and I thank you everybody for joining the session here this morning. This is our first ever public update. This is our opportunity to report back to the world what our activity has been over the last few years, and I would certainly look forward to hearing your comments and your feedback on this. As Amanda said, my name is John Mesko. I'm the Senior Director at the Soil Health Partnership. I have been here for the better part of 2 years, starting in mid-2019. And at the time that I started with the program, let's see if I can advance to our next slide here. We had a number of challenges, and I want to share some of those challenges with you and talk to you a little bit about how we overcame those challenges. I'm going to share with you some of our outputs over the last couple of years, some of the new research results we've had, what we're learning about cover crop management in particular, and a little bit about our future work and where we want to go in the future, and hope to leave some time at the end for questions and discussion if you have some. 2 years ago, really, we were facing some important challenges as an organization. We were really in need of a strong research approach. We had a lot of data. We had a lot of questions that were being asked of us by the community, but we really didn't have our research and our analysis of that data aligned so that we could answer some of those questions. We had a real need for data collection, sharing, and storage protocols. These are important for us to make sure our data is usable year over year and is able to be used with other sources of data, and we needed to implement that. I think as an organization underestimated the difficulties in dealing with yield data, and so we implemented a number of things to overcome that. We had almost no management and economic data from farmers, and we were being asked for what are the impacts on the environment, what are the impacts on the bottom line of farms when we implement various soil health building practices, and we needed more data to be able to answer those questions. And I think as an organization and as maybe as a community, we underestimated the time needed to produce viable results. 1 or 2 years of soils data does not really give us definitive answers on how practices are impacting out there in the environment. And we needed a long-term funding plan. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into that. Some of the results of those challenges, we were slow to generate outputs. I know when I started in 2019, a common comment I heard from many of you on the call and others were, we need to know what's going on. We haven't heard a lot about the data. We haven't heard a lot about the information that you're generating there. And it really boiled down to some of those challenges that were hindering us, handicapping us, if you will. We had a misalignment of resources. We really didn't have enough people working in our science staff to deliver answers that were being asked. And we had really overextended our program focus. Because we didn't have a long-term funding plan, we really focused we were not focused, and we were spreading ourselves too thin, trying to be all things to all people in hopes of establishing a strong funding plan. Well, since 2019, we've put a large emphasis on our science team. We've applied more staff resources. We've improved those data collection protocols. We now have management information, yield information, and soils information in one place so that we can analyze them together and answer some of the questions. And I'll share some of that information with you shortly. We've become more closely aligned with the national corn growers and other commodity groups. I'll talk a little bit about that. And we've had a major increase in our communication efforts and our outputs. More specifically, the investments that we made in science, we now have 5 people dedicated to managing and analyzing yield data. We have, thanks to the hard work of our field team, we have management data for most of the years that we've been working. And we have a new system for collecting data, making it more accurate, more consistent across all of the different areas where we're collecting the data. We have a new process for cleaning, analyzing, and reporting on yield data to make it more usable. And we are submitting our results and our efforts to journals, and we've had one accepted for publication, and I'll talk about that as we go as well. So getting into the information, this is really what we want to talk about today. This is to give you a highlight of the types of farms we work with at the Soil Health Partnership. As many of you know, we have over 200 sites throughout 16 states here in the US, and we have most of those sites are large sites, or at least mid-sized. You know, almost half of our network are farms of greater than 2,000 acres, and so it's not these are not niche farms. These are working cash grain operations for the most part, folks that are large-scale commodity producers. We have a wide range of experience in our farmers. Most of our farmers do have a fair amount of experience with no-till. This is the years of experience here in the brown. But when it comes to cover crops, a lot of our farmers have less than 10 years of experience. And this is important, as you'll see when we get into the data. The longer someone is using some of these practices, the more efficient, the more effective, and the more success they are having. Most of our farms, about 2/3 of our farms, are participating in a federal, state, or local conservation program like EQIP or CSP. And most of our farms, over half, are receiving a payment of some kind to plant cover crops on their farm. And we think that's important because there are many different components that go into helping a farmer understand and decide how and when to implement one of these practices. As far as data goes, we have information on our trials. For example, the geospatial characteristics of the trial, where it's located, where the plot is, where the soil sample have been taken, what the field attributes are. Is there a wet spot, or is there a drainage ditch nearby, or and so forth? Where are the treatment? Where are the controls? We have more than 200 trials, as I said. The management and economic data is something that is relatively new. Our team went out and collected that last year. We have a tremendous amount of information now on tillage, nutrient management practices, planting and harvest dates, these types of things, to help us understand how the practices are being implemented. One of the things that's really important, and you'll hear it throughout this presentation, is that many entities in the public, whether it's government or foundations or supply chain partners or consumer packaged good companies, really are interested in seeing farmers change their practices, but there's not a lot of concrete information on how to change those practices. And we think that's a real advantage that our program has, and a real value that we add. We have agronomic data, yield collected directly from the combine, processed and analyzed. We also have data that's been collected by our field team out on farms during the growing season to evaluate the cash crop progress, the cover crop progress, weed infestations, insect infestations, what is happening in real time on that field as these practices are being rolled out. And of course, soils data. Here's an example of some of the information we're collecting in terms of soils data. We have nearly 30,000 samples. We are collecting samples again this year in 2021 to add to that data set. Here's a real good composite look at some statistically significant information that we have on the impact of these practices. And this is specifically cover crop. We look at some of the soil health indicators that we measure. One is active carbon, a measure of the carbon that's in the soil. Again, over time, on our plots, we see an increase in the active carbon that is out there. Another aspect here is aggregate stability. Aggregate stability is the ability of that soil to withstand a heavy rainfall or heavy compaction, to hold up, to keep its soil structure. We see its ability increasing over time to do that when we have cover crops. Respiration, a measure of the biological activity in the soil, that is improving and increasing over time, as well as soil organic matter, and again, improving over time. We see these results in the research published in the journal Nature Food that just recently came out, and this is something that is really significant. There's a lot of speculation as to whether or not these practices actually make a difference, and our data proves that it does. Some of the anecdotal information we've received from farmers over the years has to do with farmers telling us, well, I can get out on my fields earlier because I have a cover crop or because I'm reduced tillage situation. And we started to look at that and say, okay, so if they're getting out earlier, maybe they're planting earlier, maybe there's a longer growing season. In most cases, within reason, I think we all know that in general, if we can plant earlier, we're going to have better results. There's always exceptions to that, I know. But however, we have learned, at least in 2020, when it came to soybeans, the median planting date of our farms on our research sites was, in this case in Illinois, a month or ahead of what USDA crop progress report was saying for the general area. And the same with corn, excuse me. In Indiana, we saw the median planting date over a week ahead of USDA's median planting date. So the farmers that were working with us in the studies are getting out earlier. Now, how is that impacting? That's the next round of research that we want to work on. What is the impact of that ability to get out earlier on yield and profitability? Cover crop mixes vary in our network. We see an increase in multi-species cover crops being planted. So we see, some of the states that we work in have mostly single species cover crops, mostly cereal rye, but in other places we see more complex mixes being used. This is important because, again, a cover crop is not a cover crop. There's many different ways to do a cover crop, and that's one of the big points of emphasis I want to make today. As we move north, we have shorter growing season for that cover crop. And as you can see here, in many cases, we see farmers trying to extend that cover crop growing season by interseeding into a growing cash crop. In some cases, that would be through an aerial seeding. In some cases, that might be broadcasting or drilling after the crop has been harvested. But those different methods certainly impact the cost associated with planting that crop and ultimately the economic impact as well. Over the last couple of years, we've seen an increase in farmers planting green. That is planting a cash crop into a standing growing cover crop. Again, extending that cover crop growth period a little bit longer to allow some of those soil health indicators that I just mentioned to have their effect. It also then extends the growing season for the actual cash crop. And that's a management tool that is has a really high learning curve, as you can imagine. And the farmers that we know that are doing that have varying levels of success, and over time are able to do it better and better. Now, of course, yield is really important to us, and everybody wants to know how impact of practices are on yield. And we collect our yield data directly from the Combine Yield Monitor. A lot of the other work that's being done in this soil health community rely on farmers reporting data. And there's nothing wrong with that either. It's just a difference in how we want to approach it. We think that our work is important for farmers to help them make decisions, and we want that yield information that we have to be as accurate as possible. And yields are important because we're looking for, when we think about the impact of climate change and the vast variability now that we see in weather patterns, we want to see the yields be more sustainable, more resilient, more with less variability, I should say. And so that's what we think of when we think about a farm that is resilient when in responding to some of these weather events, is can the yield maintain close to its norm when weather patterns are more fluctuating? And we think that the building of those soil health indicators improves the soil health of the farm and also the resiliency of that farm. Yield obviously is an important a driver of profit, and we analyze and process yield data in a very specific way. Our field managers import the yield data from the combine into a format and hand it off to our science team. The science team then cleans the yield data, and that is a time-consuming and expensive process. But we remove features such as end rows, waterways, places where that's not the norm or it's not the average conditions that are out there. We know that in general, combine may slow down at the end of the row to prepare for the turn. The combine may then speed up as they get into the next round as they're coming around, and that increases the error that's in those combine yield monitors, and so we look to remove those as well. We then analyze and determine average yield values for that treatment and control of the field and report that back to the farmer. And then we assess more of the impact of the practices that farmer is using, as well as the whole region, and how that's impacting the yield over time. So in 2019, we're actually just finishing up the 2020 yield data currently, but for 2019, our data did not support a yield drag or a yield boost due to cover crops on average across the network that we have. So there are varying opinions of people as to the impact of a cover crop on yield, depending on where you're talking. Some people are concerned about the cover crop taking up too much moisture, or the cover crop taking up nutrients and not having that available for the crop, and they're concerned that maybe the cover crop would reduce yields. We're not seeing that. We're seeing yields basically flat whether we have a cover crop out there or not. What we are seeing is that the manner in which that cover crop is applied impacts the yield. So whether it's a cereal rye as the primary cover crop species versus a mixture, the seeding rate may impact the yield considerably, whether it's interseeded into the crop or we've planted green possibly. And the termination, the cover crop termination, how much time prior to planting the cash crop was the cover crop terminated? And so you can see some of the differences related to yield. This is corn that we're looking at here, based on the way and the manner in which that practice was implemented. Another good example is cover crop seeding rate. Here we're seeing that actual cereal rye seeding rates above 50 pounds per acre tended to result in a yield loss. And so the question here is, the next research question could be for us, what is the right amount of cereal rye? What is the right amount of a mixture? And how do we maximize the soil health benefits, as we indicated earlier, with the yield benefits, or how do we maintain that over time? Same kind of results in soybeans. The manner in which that cover crop is implemented is what really is impacting the yield, not necessarily the presence of the cover crop. We have looked very carefully at ways that we can help farmers to learn about and understand how to implement these practices. So this is one example of a successful application of cereal rye cover crop in corn. In Indiana, we had a farmer that applied 35 pounds of cereal rye in mid-October, terminated that crop in mid-April, planted corn in early May, and we saw a 6 bushel per acre yield bump with that cover crop using that scenario on that farm. Here's another example from Indiana. This is a multi-species cover crop. You can see the species and the seeding rate. And the manner, the timing of the planting and termination, and the crop fertility program being used there. And the yield outcome was a 4.6 bushel per acre increase on average. So the yield benefit in this case was around $51 per acre, and the cost of putting that cover crop out was about $46 per acre. So this is how we are seeing impacts on yield, and it is due to the manner in which the cover crop is used. So yield is only one component of profitability. It is an important component, but it's only one. And I think one of the key things we want to think about is, can we look at practices that reduce our input costs? And conservation tillage is one of those. In our studies, conventional tillage is running about $450 per acre in corn. When we go to conservation tillage, we see that drop to around $400 per acre. When we go back and introduce cover crops, we see that cost come up, but not as much as the conventional tillage. So there again, if we are changing practices and saving costs and maintaining yield, then that's a net positive overall. Because there's so much variation year to year, farm to farm, growing seasons, weather patterns, soil types, the types of issues that farmers face in terms of obtaining cover crop seed or whatever the case may be, we've looked very carefully at some specific case studies that are informative and helpful as we think about supporting farmers wanting to make some changes. So Ryberg Farms here in Minnesota, we saw a reduction in field passes, so they use less fuel. We saw a change in their use of four-wheel drive tractors from 2 to 1, and they saved a significant amount of money that way. They participated in EQIP and CSP and brought in some revenue that way. So they saw a cost savings and a net positive as a result of implementing the practices that they did. The most recently published report we have is the conservation's impact on the farm bottom line. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But in that report, we looked at 7 SHP farms across our network, all varying in location, and the goals that they have in soil health management varied in the years that they've been working in this area, the size of the farm or the size of the area of cover crop varied quite a bit, the species, the seed cost, and the seeding method, all quite variable. And these are good examples of how the impact of the implementation is so important. So cover crops certainly can be a part of a profitable system. We see a $173 return on cover crops in general, but when we look at the folks that have the least experience, we see a lower return. And so 5 years or less, we see that the return that farmers are experiencing is lower than if they've been running cover crops or implementing this for a longer period of time. I think that's important. I think this is one of the pieces of information that nobody could have predicted, that it's going to take a little bit longer for us to see some of these results. These are, again, the differences in costs associated across recent cover croppers and experienced cover croppers. So we see a change in cover crop seed. Maybe some of those experienced folks are growing their own seed, as the next example that I'll show you. They're getting better at planting more efficiently, getting the cover crop out there. They've seen a reduction in fertilizer. They've seen an increase in the burn down costs. More experienced cover croppers, maybe gaining a better understanding what it's going to take to terminate that crop. And so we see these kinds of changes depending on the time that somebody's been using these practices. And I think that's very important. Gasser Farms from Iowa, I just did a podcast with them last week. It should be airing soon. Interesting thing that they've been able to do is to grow their own cover crop seed. So their seed costs are down to $7 per acre, and they do a lot of acres, nearly 5,000 acres of cover crop. And I think it's important to look at examples like this. So how can we look for ways to connect farmers across the network and help them achieve some of these efficiencies? I think that's part of what Soil Health Partnership can do as well. I mentioned we got a lot of data, giving you some examples of the findings that we have. This is really just scratching the surface. There's so much more that can be evaluated. There's so many more things we can do. And these are the next phase of research questions we want to evaluate. Some of the things we're looking at is to evaluate, again, the combinations of cover crop management practices leading to successful outcomes. There's plenty of initiatives out there trying to increase the number of acres of cover crops, but often what we hear from farmers is, I'm not sure how to do this, or I don't want to take a risk and do something and have it fail, or whatever the case may be. So again, a better understanding of how to do this is some of the things that we want to work on. Sustainability goals across the ag community, many of them hinge on nitrogen loss to the environment and greenhouse gases and water quality. These are things that our data can support further investigation of, how to model or calculate the impacts of practices on these things. And so I think we have an opportunity to contribute to the discussion there. You know, the soil health indicators that I mentioned to you earlier, aggregate stability, organic matter, these sorts of things, are there particular combinations of practices that have an impact on some of those and not on others? And so when we look at starting into working with a new farmer, many of them come with different goals, different objectives with their resources. And so I think we're getting to a point where farmers are going to be coming and saying, I want to work on my farm's aggregate stability. I want to work on my soil's organic matter, whatever the case may be. And I hope that we can use some of our data to say, okay, if that's your goal, we can go about it in a couple of different ways. And here's some examples. I think that yield resiliency, which then obviously is going to lead to income resiliency in most cases, is a really important factor. So climate change, the variability we've all seen in weather over the last few years is really important. It's really impacting a lot of farms. We hear this on and on. Some of the impacts that farmers will say, well, there's no such thing as a normal year anymore. These kinds of things, I think our data can help lend information and decision-making tools to help farmers understand what practices might contribute to some of that resiliency. And so I think we've got an opportunity to make some strong advancements in the study of soil health and in the ability for farmers to implement practices. One thing I want to share with you is some of the things that we've been doing recently to get the word out about our work and to let folks know some of these things. We actually, even though this may be the first time we've held one of these big announcement public webinar kind of thing, we have been putting information out now for almost 2 years consistently about the Soil Health Partnership, about the work, about the results that we've had. And as you can see here, this is all of the webinars that we've had over the last 2 years. Lots of information coming out. I encourage you, if you're not tuning in regularly, you can sign up on our website and you can hear about these things as they come. The People of Soil Health podcast is a podcast that I host, where I get a chance to visit with leaders in the farming community, in the scientific community, in every aspect of this work around how do we improve environmental outcomes and economic outcomes for farmers. And so I'd encourage you to tune in there. That's been going strong for over a year now. We have soil health information sheets. These are topical, practical guides on how to implement practices. Some of the components of the soil health indicators are discussed in here. The importance of nutrient management and so forth are some of the other examples. These are available on our website that you can download and take a look at. I mentioned earlier the newly released Conservation's Impact on the Farm Bottom Line. If there's one question that I've received more than any other in the 2 or so years that I've been around, it is, what is the economic impact of these practices? I have fielded that question numerous times, and this is an important step in that direction. This is a joint effort between the Soil Health Partnership, Environmental Defense Fund, and the accounting firm, Keiko Isom. And I think it's an important distinction that we've got economists working on this. These farms that we studied in this report opened up their books to us. They gave us unprecedented access to information that they have about how they're implementing these practices and the impact on their farm finances. And so again, that's the website that you can go to there and get a hold of that and read that. It's a pleasure to be able to answer that question that I've had so many times, and we're going to continue to look at that question and continue to come out with information like this in the future. We've also been published in industry and scientific publications. I mentioned earlier that we've had a peer-reviewed journal, Nature Food, publish these findings. The report that, or the data that I shared with you, much of that contributed to this report. This is an important step for our program in that we are able to demonstrate that our science is sound, and we are able to demonstrate that we have relevance in both the farming community and the scientific community. Many of you on this call have participated with us on social media, and so that's really an exciting piece of it for us. When you see something coming across and then you share it with your network, it really helps to get the word out about not only our program, but more importantly, the findings and the results that we're having. So social media has been a big effort for us, and it's certainly returning quite a bit of interest and in our program and in our results. I mentioned earlier how we think about, how we, being the community, think about sustainability goals. Just about every organization that I work with on a regular basis, whether that's the National Corn Growers or one of the supply chain companies that feed farmers inputs, whether it's a food company that's taking outputs from farms and turning them into food, a foundation, USDA, everybody's got a goal in mind for what they'd like to see happen as a result of their activity in the ag and food community. Almost all of those goals depend on farmers changing their practices. And I think it makes sense. The production of food is one of the biggest uses of land that we have. 170 million acres in the United States is dedicated to row crop production, and so this is a big impact on our environment. And so it makes sense that that's the case. And yet, what I find as a former farmer myself and someone who's worked in agriculture with farmers for many, many years is there's not a lot of attention paid to helping farmers understand how to make that practice change. And so really we think that our efforts contribute to that from the perspective of farmers specifically. So it's great to have sustainability goals, but we need education and outreach if we're going to achieve successful outcomes for farmers. And when we say education, we're talking about really the research, the kind of research that's being done at SHP, the kind of peer-to-peer networking opportunities that we provide through through social media, through our winter research meetings where we bring farmers together and have them learn about and share the impacts of these practices. Our communications, it needs to be something that's in a form that can be digested efficiently and effectively for farmers. It needs to come in a regular flow so that people don't lose track of it and are prepared to hear about it when it comes. And one of the things we're learning, as this data that I just shared with you points out, the longer a farmer is implementing these practices, the more successful they are. So we recognize that there's a learning curve or a period of time early on when there are some additional risks, there are some additional financial expenses involved in getting to success. And so we think that there's a real place for some financial offsets to help de-risk some of these practices. As I mentioned, a lot of our farms are already implementing some of those. And so we think that all these things together can be a sustainability ground game that SHP can contribute to the broader community to help bring about some of these sustainability goals. And I want to talk just briefly about a new initiative that we're starting called the Farmers for Soil Health. And really, this is a farmer-led, science-based program initiative that is rooted in peer-to-peer learning. We have new communications efforts planned around this, and we look to reduce some financial risks associated with it. The Farmers for Soil Health is a farmer-driven initiative that involves soil health partnership through the National Corn Growers Association. As I mentioned early on, we are looking to connect more closely with farmers through their member commodity groups like corn, United Soybean Board, and the National Pork Board. And our mission is to advance these conservation practices and build soil health across a vast majority of commodity crop acres. There's a lot of initiatives and has been a lot of initiatives for many, many years to increase the number of acres that are being used, that are having cover crops, for example, or reduced tillage, but we're a long ways away from having a majority of those acres. And that's really the goal of this program. So we have started working with these commodity groups, and many of you on the call are aware of some of the things that we're working on to put together. We're putting together some grant proposals here in the near future that we are seeking matching funds for to help leverage those dollars with federal dollars and bring those resources into the areas where we're working to help bring forward some of these practices in a meaningful way.